Hello all. This bonus episode material is a bit different from what we've done in the past, in that I, Ariel, will be talking to a political candidate for the provincial Ontario election, which was called suddenly just a few weeks ago, and Ontarians will be going to the polls on February 27th. As Solarpunks, we may differ in opinion on how best to bring about the bright green future that we would like, but for many, voting in democratic elections is a major tool in their Solarpunk toolkit. I would argue that for specifically the Canadian political system, it is a very strong tool that can help Solarpunks choose their allies and enemies in government, who they will eventually have to work with in order to effect meaningful change. Not to say that meaningful change cannot happen outside of governmental systems, but that in the 21st century, the hand we have been dealt is that direct democracy is one of the best ways to make a difference in laying the groundwork for a Solarpunk future. In meme speak, we live in a society, and some people are very good at manipulating that. It's a good idea to scale up. A lot of very politically active Canadians are watching this election with keen interest, and I'm of the opinion that this is an opportunity to push societal norms even just a little more towards policies that will lay the groundwork for a Solarpunk future. I do not mean this to be an endorsement for any political party in particular, but I do want to take the opportunity to insert Solarpunk talking points into the Canadian policy landscape. Okay, let's go. Hi listeners, welcome to a very special bonus episode of the Solarpunk Presents podcast. Today I'm joined by Brooklin Wallis, who is the new Democratic Party, aka NDP, candidate for the riding of Kitchener Centre. Brooklin is a community activist and politician. She ran for council in 2022, and her list of accomplishments and involvements is super impressive. She joined the board of Fair Vote Canada Waterloo to fight for electoral reform, and the board of Spectrum Waterloo Region's Rainbow Community Gathering Space. She was also elected chair of Kitchener's Climate Change and Environment Committee and went on to co-found the Waterloo Region chapter of Acorn after local affordable housing was allowed to be paved over for a parking lot. Like, literally. Acorn, by the way, stands for Association of Community Organizations for Reform Now and is many things, but we can probably just boil it down for now to being the National Canadian Tenants Union. Brooklin, thanks so much for sitting down to chat with me.
Thank you so much for having me on.
I'm not exactly a hard-hitting journalist, but I have a couple of questions that I think that I and many of our listeners would like to hear about.
Yes, of course.
Just maybe could you start with what made you want to run for the NDP in the first place?
So specifically for the NDP? Yeah.
Like why the NDP and not another party? And like maybe just describe the NDP a little bit for our non-Canadian listeners, like what's so great about them, what really resonated with you?
The NDP are the largest leftist, and I mean like most left, political party in Canada. There are provincial organizations as well as the one large federal one. So I'm running in for the Ontario NDP right now.
Mm-hmm.
Out of all of the Ontario parties, I see it both as the party most aligned with my views individually, as well as the party that is most primed to be able to actually accomplish things.
Nice.
A big part of what separates it from the Green Party for me is the focus on unions and worker solidarity and worker strength and union strength.
Mm-hmm.
That's something I don't see in the Green Party, which is the other like left-wing party in Ontario, and it's something that I think is too important to miss out on.
Okay. So before the interview, you told me that you're familiar with Solarpunk, and in fact that a lot of your goals are Solarpunk leaning. And so I wanted to ask you, how do you think your Solarpunk values sort of show up in your political goals and your strategy? So tell us a bit about that.
So it mostly comes to my work in regards to pedestrian infrastructure and local green space and stuff like that.
Right.
I have been advocating on the Climate Change Committee at Kitchener for closing down King Street for a long time. Our main street, I think it would do much better as a pedestrian-focused area, maybe with some transit going through, but still mostly focused on pedestrians and cyclists and the fact that they actually then go into buildings a lot more than drivers do. I also have lots of experience with renewable technology. I have education in renewable tech, and I really want to see solar panels on buildings and having shade while walking down large streets and stuff, and having lots of green space and having water features and things like that, surrounded by Solarpunk style windows and solar panels and all of the things that really make me excited for what the future could look like.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I've often thought walking down King Street, like it's very much a wind tunnel.
Oh,
Yeah,
it's
because
so
there's not
bad.
a whole lot of features to it. So
Yeah,
putting in more features would maybe help with that. And, wind power is definitely something I think about every time that I'm like fighting my way through the wind.
yes.
To get through downtown and thinking, man, we should really harness this. This would be great. That's awesome to
We
hear.
have to have big wind studies every time we build a large building because it does affect wind patterns by quite a lot. But the fact that it affects wind patterns and we know that it affects wind patterns, and also we have this form of energy that can harness affected wind patterns, I feel like it's just something that we could tap into that.
Yeah, yeah, I think it makes sense. Now, I wanted to ask you because with Solarpunk, we're sort of scattered all across the political spectrum, which makes sense because we're all
Yeah.
scattered across kind of like the world, and there are different political formations within the world, right? But I wanted explicitly to sort of ask you how you reconcile being a political candidate in a system that might not align totally with Solarpunk values, such as like socialism or anarchism and self-governance. Like, what sort of like how do you square that circle in your own mind?
So we live in the world that we live in.
Hmm.
And there are steps to change it that we can take. And this is the step I've chosen to
Mm.
take to change it. I can't change every aspect of the world that people find unjust or anything like that. And I shouldn't be trying to because that's a great way to just burn myself out.
Mm.
I think for me personally, I have chosen the things that I really care deeply passionately about and found a way that I can go about affecting that. And that is through electoral politics right now. And it might not always stay that way. It might work really well. It might not work really well, and I'll have to start finding different ways. But that's how it works in my head. Is just I can't do everything all at once.
Mhm.
I have to sort of choose my battles. And this is the way that I can do the good stuff in other, like the more important good stuff. And that's what's important to me is the more important good stuff. Don't let perfection get in the way of doing good.
Yeah, definitely. Letting perfection be the enemy of the good, I think, is what stymies a lot of positive change that could happen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we see
And
that inside of the left a lot
yeah.
is if you don't agree with everything that I do, like if you don't agree with someone's specific every ideology, then they'll consider you too far right or too far left in the other way. And we can get sort of bogged down in that instead
Yeah.
of finding unity.
Finding unity even despite our differences, I think,
Yeah.
is something that needs to happen. And it sounds to me like, this being part of the democratic process is the most effective tool that you've found to sort of really change the things that you're passionate about.
Yeah. And it uses my skills in a way that I find encouraging almost. I fit into this role fairly well.
Okay.
It doesn't mean that everyone else should try to
Mhm.
fit into that role or should even think about trying to fit into that role. It's just, this is the way I feel inclined toward to doing the good work.
Mm.
And I need other people who want to do all of the other ways to work together to accomplish the things that we all want.
Yeah, so you see yourself having a specific sort of role within that network.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah,
cool.
I can't do this by myself, but we
Yeah,
do need people in power to be able to do this.
yeah. Doing it all yourself is a great way to burn out.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to get a little bit more specific now and just
Yeah.
ask you a couple of policy questions. So I've chosen the ones that I think really resonate with Solarpunk values and also things that actually are issues in the Waterloo regions. So, like, for example, the housing crisis. It's kind of a big deal.
Yeah. You could say
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. For those of you who aren't Canadian, there's a housing squeeze pretty much in every city. I'd say, like Vancouver, Toronto, Montreal, those are the really big ones where it's a problem. But Waterloo Region is maybe like the second most problematic in the province,
It's
I would say.
it's one of the worst in Canada.
Yeah, it's real bad.
It's
And
more expensive here than in Montreal.
wow, I did not know that.
Yeah.
That's wow.
By
Okay.
like a few $100s a month for rent.
Oh, wow. Wow, it's gotten that bad already. Wow.
Yeah. And it's been like that for years. There was a talking point during when I ran for city council in 2022.
Mhm.
Like I was talking about it then, and
Mhm.
it's actually just gotten worse since then. It's embarrassing.
Yeah, as I understand it, it's kind of a post-COVID thing, or like during COVID, I think a lot of people wanted to move to the region and that drove up the prices or something like that.
Yeah.
That's
There's a bunch of factors in it. Part of it is the fact that Montreal builds housing a lot more than we do. So their
Mhm.
prices have just actually been able to stay low.
All right. I mean, I guess that leads into my question of,
Yeah.
so what are you thinking about in terms of your goals? How would you advocate for easing this housing crisis? Like both, like we have a huge homelessness crisis, and we also have a huge crisis in the fact that like millennials and younger can't really afford to own a house at all or have to take on enormous debt to do that, or like, seniors can't downsize because they just can't afford to leave the houses that they're in.
Yeah. Homelessness is one of the things that I wanted to run on in the first place. A few years ago, there was a homeless encampment of 6 people that was evicted using actual bulldozers and excavators. Like it made me really mad. And that's when I said, like, okay, next year I'm gonna run for city council. And I spent a year basically just researching ways to help it because I didn't know yet how to help. I didn't know how to do any of this.
Mm.
I had no idea, but I knew that that style of eviction was wrong. And I knew that there had to be solutions. And I found solutions. One of them being the best way to keep house prices low is to actually build enough houses for the supply or for the demand of the area.
Right.
We are very much not doing that.
Mm.
Our vacancy rate is like 2% or something like that. It should be up at 5% or so or more. The way that we help build houses without also destroying our environment, destroying our farmland, and what little aquifer space we have left in the region is just by intensification. We have to be building inwards. We have to be doing infill. We have to be allowing for denser forms of housing to exist. Right now, most of the city you can only build a single detached house in, and that's the case in most cities in North America. Oddly enough, not the case in Montreal. One of the places that has done that and is probably the biggest city in North America that also has the lowest prices for the size that it is.
Interesting. Yeah.
So by restricting the types of housing that get built, we are artificially limiting how many houses can actually be built within the city. And that is much more environmentally expensive than having 4-story lockups and the closer knit communities that come with that sort of housing style, as well as just having like little small isolated downtowns or like main streets throughout the city. It also means that you don't need to drive as far. Right now, if you want to go anywhere approximating downtown, you have to come downtown Kitchener. But we could have little strips and little sections of the city that are closer built, that have housing on top of little stores and stuff like that, that could be their own little economic zones, little areas that are actually pulling in a lot of tax income, as well as meaning that people don't need to drive 20 minutes to do everything,
Right.
which is a major thing of the environment that we need to be fixing.
Yeah. And
Major
also,
drain.
right now is we're in the middle of a snowstorm, and I'm
Yes.
thinking about the fact that, oh, it would be really nice if all of the stuff that needed to live was within, a 15-minute walk, because
Yeah.
the roads are terrible. I would not be trying to drive today at all. And
Seriously.
that's just a reality of living here, is that we're in the snow belt and sometimes we get giant dumps of snow. And I mean, as climate change sort of progresses, we're going to get a lot more of weird,
Yeah.
extreme weather. Yeah.
We're gonna be getting a lot more freezing rain in the
Mm,
next 10 to 20 years as well. And we need to be prepared for that, which is going to be tough. If we're using lots of salt, that is damaging our aquifer even more. And what are we going to be doing if we are using salt? So
right,
we need
right.
to be planning for what the future of the climate here actually is going to be bringing along.
Right. And for those of you who aren't in the know, Waterloo region, so Kitchener, and the surrounding cities are actually sitting on top of a pretty important aquifer from which we draw most of our drinking water. So we're pretty concerned about the whole salt situation. That's something that should be top of mind.
The whole region is based off of groundwater.
Hmm.
So if we build too much and prevent this aquifer from refilling, then we're out of luck. Like if we build on too much floodplains and stuff like that, we are in trouble. If we contaminate our water supply, we are in trouble. We've thought about building a pipeline to Lake Erie
Yeah.
before, and that would be a very expensive endeavor. And then we're sharing water with a nation that's been a little bit hard to pin down on things recently. So let's keep that water sovereignty here, please.
Yeah, yeah, water sovereignty is definitely something that we want to preserve. Going back to, you mentioned environmental cost of housing, and I was just wondering, with the houses that you're planning to have built, I would be interested to know, what are you planning for sustainability of design to withstand climate catastrophe? Because that can be quite expensive. And so I'm kind of trying to sort of like justify or square kind of affordable housing on the one hand, and then also sustainable housing, or houses that have things like stormwater mitigation and have solar panels and heat pumps and extra insulation. These things are quite expensive. So
Yeah.
I'm sort of wondering how that is going to fit together, how you
For
see
one,
that.
I think that we should be subsidizing these things, that we need to be incentivizing and helping pay for these costs to keep costs on the end user down for the future home buyer, while also making sure that we have these protections and forethought in place. At the same time, these denser forms of housing are just better for the environment in the first place.
Hmm.
Yes, it can cost quite a bit of carbon output to build, especially concrete towers and stuff like that. But the fact is that when you are shooting a separate house entirely by yourself,
Mhm.
that takes a lot of energy. If
Mm.
your walls are touching your neighbor's walls, then you're actually able to keep each other warm a little bit,
Mm.
and your overall costs are down. And when there's 6 of you all stacked on top of each other, then that effect is even more so. The insulation between units doesn't need to be as high. So we
Mm.
can actually get a bulk buying effect almost by
Oh,
doing these sorts of things in larger buildings. It is easier, much easier to ask one builder to do these things sustainably than it is to ask 6 different home buyers to be doing these things.
Right. But I mean, one of the objections I've heard from a lot of people about living in these more sustainable three-story walk-ups or apartments is like you said, sort of like there won't have to be that much insulation between the walls. But when that does happen, then people, can hear their neighbors and they don't like that. There's not really a sense of privacy.
There is that. I have lived in places that have really good insulation or like noise insulation between apartments it's never been an issue. Like hearing people or having other people hear me has never been an issue in those places. How did they do that? I'm not sure. I didn't look up the plans of that specific building, if I'm being honest.
I won't grill you on, building code specifics because
Yeah.
that's not exactly your area of expertise, but I'm glad to hear that you've thought about this kind of thing.
I do a lot of building code research and stuff like that as well, but it's more based on the zoning aspects of it than the code of like how we do all of those parts.
Right. So what I'm hearing then is if you were elected, then one of the things that you would be really sort of focusing on is changing those zoning laws in the first place.
Yes, and that's something that the NDP has been pushing for a while now, is allowing 4-story buildings, 4-story housing units throughout basically all of Ontario. That increase in density would allow for so many more houses. If 10% available space was used for first houses instead of one house, like that is a massive increase in available housing space.
Yeah, for sure. Now the tough question, where would you get the money for this? I know that sort of comes into play.
So asking for zoning changes doesn't cost any money, really. I mean, there is some bureaucratic cost on making sure all of the different cities are following those rules and just the cost of the bureaucracy of everything. But I'm not talking about building our own housing for everything, which is something that we need to be doing. The government does need to be building supportive housing, but allowing for the market to start building smaller forms of housing at cost-effective rates, it would allow for a lot of external investment in this sort of thing. And it allows for smaller companies to do it as well. Because right now, a lot of the cost of building a smaller house comes from the fact that you have to ask permission from City Hall to change the zoning for that area. That can cost $30,000 whenever you apply for any single building, alongside every other change that you might want to do, which gets added to the cost of the time that it takes to go through City Council. It adds up really quickly, and it prices out everything but the biggest, tallest buildings, because after a certain point, you can just throw on another story to a building and it's basically pure profit. Once you have the foundation down, what's the difference between a 30-story building and a 40-story building? Well, 10 stories of houses that they get to sell.
Okay.
But that, of course, takes a massive loan from a bank or anything like that. That takes a lot of resources to do, and small developers can't do that. They can, however, build a 4-story building that's all entirely made out of lumber and maybe some concrete or brick or anything at the bottom. And then, and it's a much shorter period of time for the turnaround. Instead of it being a 5-year build, it can be a 6-month build. And that is a lot more appealing to investors and to banks and all of that stuff. We need to be making it easy for smaller people to be building these things as well.
Yeah. I have a question that's a little bit adjacent.
Yeah.
We're going back to when you said taking out a loan from the bank. That got me thinking about how we did a lot of Solarpunk interviews with people who advocate for different forms of housing. So communal housing, co-op, that sort of thing. I've been sort of looking it up and realizing that in Canada, it's very difficult to get loans for those different modes of housing. And is that something at all that's sort of on your radar?
Absolutely. I am so jealous of my friends who live in co-op housing in the region. I really wish I could get in on that. It makes so much sense to have housing that is a communal resource instead of something that a company can make money on. And because of the system we're in, we do need some people to be able to make money on housing because it doesn't get built otherwise. But I would love to shift that whole perspective into co-op housing and giving loans for co-ops and making it easier to get and build co-ops. That is something that the ONDP also strongly believes is funding those housing co-ops and actually making sure that we are decommodifying housing as a resource and making it just a right that everyone has. Unfortunately, that takes a little while, but we can start making those steps right away. We used to take those steps for a long time in Canada. There was a lot of housing funding for co-ops, but it has all but dried up in the past couple decades. And we need to start doing that again.
Yeah, of course. I will take this opportunity then to turn just very quickly to transit. Transit in the Waterloo region is kind of a big issue. And I mean, since we're talking about housing and we're talking about being able to get to where you want to go in a very convenient manner, transit in Waterloo region, we have a light rail transit. We technically have a train that stops here. We have buses, bike lanes. Brooklyn, kind of what are your thoughts on transit and how do you see it sort of playing into this overall strategy for making life better in Kitchener Center?
So I don't have a car. I have a bike, I have my feet, and I have a bus pass. That is all I ever want to need in Kitchener. I get to do that because I live downtown, but I recognize that that's not doable in most of the city. I want that to be doable in the whole city. I want Cambridge to actually get connected by the Ion.
Ariel here, just dropping in to say that Cambridge is the closest neighboring city to the cities of Kitchener and Waterloo, and though we have a bus that runs between the two cities, it is not frequent enough to serve the needs of many who commute between the two cities for work and play. Okay, back to the show.
I'm so proud that we have the Ion. We are the smallest city in North America with an LRT, and
just for listeners,
I love it.
Ion is the LRT. So
yes,
these two things go together.
It's just the name of our LRT. We also absolutely need to be increasing the transit options from here to Toronto, from here to Guelph, from here to Hamilton, especially. Because there is never any way to Hamilton from here. It is always you have to go to Toronto and then go back, which like triples the length of the trip.
Ariel here again, dropping in with a bit more additional context. Brooklyn is here referring to how every train and almost every bus goes only into and out of Toronto, like traveling down the spokes of a wheel. Traveling across from one small city to another necessitates first going into Toronto and then out again another way, usually taking many hours. The single train company that we have, which runs most of the buses also, is called GO for Government of Ontario.
We need two-way all-way go, all-day go. Absolutely, we've been fighting for that for a long time. There are tracks being put down, but it still hasn't been actually promised by the government, and that is something that the other local MPPs and I will be fighting for in legislature. The consistency of that trip. Right now, on the weekends, you're out of luck for the most part. You have to take a bus from halfway here, and it takes so long, and it has a whole bunch of different stops. It's not as nice of a trip because trains are wonderful and all of that. I would love to see a high-speed rail be put in between like Hamilton or the area all the way out to Montreal or Quebec City. That is the prime location for that sort of thing, and it's terrible that we don't have that. It would really help our problems on the 401 and the congestion that we see in Toronto and just all of those things. And it would make it so poor people can get around much easier. It shouldn't be a class issue on whether or not it takes you 10 hours to get to Ottawa, or if it takes you 6 hours or 4 hours to get to Ottawa. It shouldn't be decided based on your class.
I agree with you there. I think the bottom line is we have transit, but it is not accessible. And
Yeah,
so making it more accessible is something that you're passionate about, I'm hearing.
absolutely.
I was wondering, in the legislature, how do you plan to get others sort of on board with these goals? Because you're going to need a lot of support,
Absolutely.
policy support. And so what are you thinking about when it comes to working with other people? What's kind of your go-to?
I am really good at having convincing conversations.
Hmm.
And sometimes I'm the one who gets convinced. But I think that's a strength of mine is that I am very clearly willing and excited to be wrong. And when I bring that into a conversation, the other person tends to start to mimic that. And we can find a middle ground really quickly, really easily, when both people are entering with the goal of just finding the best solution instead of, I'm going to convince you that I'm right.
Mm,
Because no one wants to be proven wrong, or
right.
I mean, most people don't want to be proven wrong. I like being proven wrong outside of the ego of it, because I mean, I am an ego. We all do. I don't like being wrong, but I like when I am shown that I'm wrong. It means that I get to be right in the future.
Oh, that's a really great way of thinking about that. Okay.
And I think bringing that into the conversation is really important. And yes, I would be a part of the NDP, but I also know enough conservative people. I know enough liberals, and I know the Green Party pretty fairly well. I've had many interactions with Mike Schreiner.
Mike Schreiner is the member of provincial parliament for the Ontario Green Party, and he represents Guelph, Ontario.
That maybe this is the naivety of youth, but I think that I can get people to listen.
I think that's the kind of discourse and the type of attitude that all MPs and MPPs should sort of come to legislature with is, the willingness to be wrong, but for the sake of getting stuff done.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And a lot of people go into it thinking, well, I'm one party, no one else is going to listen to me. And a lot of people will see, oh, you're from the other party, I'm not going to listen to you. I think that I will be able to, it might take some time, but I'll be able to cultivate the image of this person's willing to work with anyone as long as it makes this province better.
Wonderful. I know we're sort of over time a little bit. I'm so
Oh, no worries.
I just want to ask you a couple of last questions.
Yeah.
I want to zoom out a little bit. I do think that while a lot of your plans involve sort of improving Kitchener Center, we can't ignore the fact that, as we mentioned a little bit earlier, that US policy will have impact on local businesses. And I'm talking specifically about the tariffs that are coming next month. Could you speak on that a bit? How do you plan to help local Kitchener residents who are affected by these measures?
There are a lot of ways that the NDP are planning on protecting workers here in Ontario. One of those ways is really combating the cost of living. We have a grocery rebate plan where eligible families or people will be able to get up to $120 a month just to pay groceries.
Okay.
When it comes to jobs, I think there's no party more suited towards fighting for workers and fighting for jobs than the NDP. We are made out of union members. The very inception of this party was based around unions and people power. And we're the only party that I trust to actually fully commit to protecting every single job in Ontario, and not just the ones that happen to be wealthy donators to my party or anything, but the people who are working in the car industry, the individuals who are working in the car industry, not just the auto industry in general.
Mm.
The way that the NDP approaches things is by looking at the worker and not the corporation and not the business or what the business can do. For us as the party, we are always focused on the individual people and what people need itself. We will fight as hard as we can, and I'm sure that there are lots of solutions that we'll have to come up with on the fly. We don't know exactly what's going to happen, but the ONDP is the party that I trust to actually look out for us.
Thank you so much for joining me today, Brooklyn. This has been a really fascinating conversation, and I feel like I learned a lot about your goals for Kitchener Center. Do you have any advice for how Solarpunks could get more involved in changing their home status quo, maybe?
Get involved in city council. Get involved in local advocate groups or make a local advocate group. Look, like you can find a group anywhere in the world, and most of the time you can just send an email, ask how they got things set up, and they're very happy to reply to you. Every time I've ever done this, people are so excited to share knowledge. Don't try to do it by yourself because you can't. This is a group effort. This is a generational effort. And know that generational efforts are not done in bursts. They are not sprints. They are marathons. But you do need to run, you need to train to run a marathon, and you do need to actually be running to finish that marathon. So make sure that you're getting out there, you're talking to city councilors. It is a lot easier to do it than you think. You can just show up at city council, send an email, or do any of that. You can just go and do it. So my suggestion is just go and do it.
That's super inspirational.
Just do it. No one's stopping you.
Yeah. Where can listeners go to learn more about you as a candidate and about the provincial NDP platform?
So my website is brooklynwallis.ontarionDP.ca. My Twitter account is at Brooklyn WR, and all of this is Brooklyn with an I. I spell it like the town in Ontario that I'm from. And I use Brooklyn WR on every major social media platform that you can go and find me there. And the NDP's policy and platform you can all find on our news feed. There are some good posts on there with lots of detailed information about how we plan to do all of these things. And pretty much every answer is there. And if you have a question that isn't answered there, feel free to reach out. My email is brooklyn.wallis@ontarionDP.ca.
Awesome. Thank you so much. You might be hearing from some listeners very soon. So
I would love to. Thank you so much for having me.
yeah, thank you so much, Brooklyn, for coming in to talk to me. And that's a wrap on this bonus interview with Brooklin Wallis, NDP candidate for Kitchener Centre in the 2025 SNAP provincial election. Stay tuned for another bonus episode later this week, featuring my interview with Ashlyn Clancy, Green Party candidate and incumbent for Kitchener Centre. Voting can be a tool that helps stack the cards in Solarpunk's favor. So get out there and exercise your democratic rights, and remember to stay Solarpunk.
Thank you for listening to Solarpunk Presents, a podcast hosted and produced by Ariel, Kroon, and Christina de la Rocha.
The audio for this episode was recorded in part on the traditional territory of the neutral Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples.
And in Germany. The opening and closing music for this podcast is Water Cooler Gang by Monkey Warhol, available for use under the Creative Commons Attribution 4.0 International License.
Don't forget to support us on Patreon at patreon.com/solarpunkpresents.
Every little bit helps us keep bringing you discussions and interviews.
Until the next episode, keep dreaming.
And stay Solarpunk.